the treasures under the stone might be linked with this big stone, which is the statue of Peter the Great, but obviously the theme of stone is central to the idea of Petersburg in general. And of course, the irony here would be he is actually hiding his light under a bushel, as it were. He's not making use of these riches that he's gained, which was part of his altruistic explanation of his theory of why the crime was committed. So already we have some doubts about his true motivations. Though, as I said before, I mean, I'm not convinced that with Raskolnikov it's always the case that you go from the alleged motive to another one, which then undermines any validity of the previous one, because in actual fact all these things are combined. In him it can be a theoretical desire to do good, it can be one specifically connected with his sort of guilty feelings before his family, and so on and so forth. Obviously the ideas of the extraordinary man and the purely existential themes are probably more important and more sort of crucial to what he's doing, but it doesn't mean that these other factors are not there as well. So it's better to see it all as a combination of motivations, essentially. Okay, we sort of said that the actual this sort of split takes place throughout. So one moment you'll be thinking, oh yes, I can do good and I can receive good acts of charity. The next moment you'll think, how can I do that if I'm a murderer? And we said at the top of page 104 that his state mature undermines this utilitarian argument he had, and to some extent the great man argument as well, because presumably the two things go together. In order to do these things as a great man, he needs some starting point, he needs some help essentially as this poor student. So that's one of the reasons why he would need this, this foot up, this helping hand of the money. And the fact that he didn't even look at the purse makes us wonder about that motivation. So don't think there's too much here we need to say. On page 107, when he's walking back and he almost gets hit by a carriage driver with his whip, I think we can think of other examples in the text we've seen before. Yevgeny in his madness, remember when he sort of is walking through the streets, he doesn't notice that the coachman and they whip him, and obviously Akaky Kakavich is always oblivious to his surroundings. So the fact that Raskolnikov is within this particular narrative does seem to be significant. And of course it's already seen him as the victim again, like the horse was being whipped, so too Raskolnikov is being whipped here. And the fact that someone takes him as a beggar, gives him this 20 kopek piece of charity, and he'll throw this away because he thinks, no, I just can't accept this charity. Who am I to be helped in the name of Christ, for the love of Christ, when I've done such a terrible thing? We mentioned before, I think, the 108, that view of St. Petersburg, supposedly got a bit further than I thought. Okay, so the blood in number 110, as I said, that's connected possibly with Shakespeare, and it's the double blood. This is the blood for doing good when he's been helping out Marmeladov, as opposed to the blood on him from killing the pawnbroker. Let's see. What else do you want to say there? Okay, on page 118, the conversation with Razumikin, he says at the bottom, don't worry, not a word was uttered about the Countess. So I think a lot of the footnote will say, and you would probably take it as being a reference to the Queen of Spades, and that's the most likely thing. I think there is another word in Russian literature when they say, oh, what will this particular princess say about something? It's a set phrase. So that could be the initial implication. But the deeper one would be, of course, within the text, to what extent is Raskolnikov to be seen as a Herman-type figure, that his crime in murdering the pawnbroker is not dissimilar to what Herman did in Queen of Spades. So that's important there. Page 119, when the account is given of Raskolnikov's statements in his delirium, basically all the evidence is there, isn't it? That he's talking about things connected with the robbery, he's talking about some trouser ends, he's talking about socks, he's talking about blood, etc., etc. So it's not difficult when you've got these bits of evidence to think, okay, there's something very strange going on. And of course, Porfiry later on is able to put all these things together from the different accounts he gets from Zamyatov, from Razumikin, and so on, to think, yes, okay, there's something very odd going on here, plus the fact that this guy is the only one of the people who's got pledges with the pawnbroker who hasn't come to see me as yet, and I've read his article, which also explains, perhaps to me, something of the backstory of the crime and so on and so forth. So from the very beginning, with all these bits of evidence, Porfiry will have a pretty good idea that Raskolnikov is the most likely person to have committed the crime. But you don't have to be a great detective like Porfiry to know that there's something strange going on here. But obviously Zametov, Razumikin, and so on, because they want to think the best of Raskolnikov, will sometimes ignore the evidence of their own eyes and ears, particularly in the case of Razumikin, of course. Okay, I don't think there's much in the next few pages there. Let's see. Page 124, this reference to the Palais de Cristal, so that's the rather ironic, jokey name of the tavern that they go to. And I said before, the Crystal Palace was this amazing building built in London in 1851 for the Great Exhibition, and it was used increasingly as a symbol of the type of utopian, type of buildings that would exist in the future, almost like some, Wisconsin Dells sort of park where, all year round it's 88 degrees and really sort of nice and everyone's happy and lots of air and so on and so forth. And we all have a sort of perfectly sort of, calm and happy life with no problems at all. So this is the image of the Crystal Palace, or the phalansteries, which we'll talk about later, Fourier, other utopian thinkers. So the irony of this dive bar in Petersburg being called the Crystal Palace does seem to be quite significant. Because, as we said before, for the underground man, the problem with the Crystal Palace is believing that life only has to be about contentment, happiness, stability, and so on. Actual human beings are far more complicated than that, and maybe even evil can be a good, and certainly the darkness is also necessary. This world of artificial light 24/7 is highly problematic, it turns out, in the Russian context. And when we come to the 20th century, some of the first anti-utopian, i.e. dystopian works like Zamyatin's We will really be built around this notion of the Crystal Palace. The one state in that world, and this is a book that is a precursor of 1984 and Brave New World and many other science fiction texts, essentially this place where everyone lives happily ever after, but in fact they're not happy at all because the options they have are very restricted. So this is what Raskolnikov is protesting against at some levels, although he also comes out of this utilitarian socialist tradition. Okay, so I think the fact that Dostoevsky chooses painters or decorators as as one of the fall guys in the text might be significant. It's hard to know exactly why, but for example, the words of Karamazov, his most famous novel, The Karamazov Brothers, the words of Kara in Turkish means black, and the Russian verb mazats means to paint or to daub. So in some ways, they're people who sort of daubed or painted with black, or people who sort of paint in black, essentially. Okay, and indeed in one place in the Brothers Karamazov, someone gets the name of the characters wrong and really implies that somehow these people are painters or decorators. So there does seem to be some strange connection here taking place. So whether it's the painting with some sort of guilt, with blood or darkness, it's at some level this idea was present in Dostoevsky's head. Okay, so also what we find out about the painters and decorators, and particularly sort of Mikolka or Nikolka, is that ultimately he's an old believer. So we've said before that the old believers were these heretical groups who protested against the religious reforms that were associated with Peter the Great and his regime. Some of the main reasons for their disagreement with the new religious beliefs were apparently quite trivial. It would be how you would spell the name of Jesus with one E at the beginning or sort of two E's. It would be whether you would use 3 fingers and making the sign of the cross or 2. But these were distinctions they were actually willing to die for. So it is quite significant. And the old believers were often socially quite radical. They were often a part of an underclass in Petersburg. Many of them then went to the far-flung parts of the Russian Empire into Siberia to live in their sort of utopian communal peasant villages. And even at the beginning of the 20th century, there were communities in deeper Siberia who would never come into contact with any of the sort of trappings of civilization. So there would be found in the 20th century these communities who had lived there thousands of miles away from anyone, never seen a car, never seen a plane, never seen a telephone, a television, anything like that, and sort of living in this. And they're still there, of course, these old believers in Russia. And the fact that Mikolka is an old believer does seem to be significant, because then that links him up with Raskolnikov, Raskol being the schismatic, the same type of old believers. And it's generally thought that the old believers were opposed to Peter the Great in all sorts of ways. So that's another significant, I think, sort of paradoxical element, that how can Raskolnikov have a Petrine idea, the idea to be the great man, to transform everything, when in some ways he's actually, by his name, apparently opposed to those ideas, and probably represent something more truly Russian, more connected with the soul, with the earth, which would be the way of the old believers. It also seems the old believers had something of a cult of suffering, that they did want to become martyrs. And there were lots of very interesting Russian religious sects. There's one group called the Priguni, the jumpers, who believed that if you sort of jumped up and down high enough, you could increase the ability to get higher and higher, and eventually at some time in the future you might be able to have a type of rapture, jump all the way up to heaven, which was quite a extreme notion. But the more common ones are the Khlisti, the flagellants, who would think they had to whip themselves a lot or be whipped in order to get closer to Christ. There's a strange sadomasochistic element of this particular group. And then another group called the Skapsi, or the castrates, who probably, you can guess what they did. And you could either be a full castrate, which would involve removing all of the genitals, or you could be as a partial one, which only involves a part of removing the genitals. So these are the different types of these very extreme religious of sects, and in some ways this sort of cult of suffering to get closer to God is, it's not explicit in Dostoevsky's work, but for example in The Idiot, the anti-hero Rogozhin, he's from a family of castrates, or well, probably could literally be from a family of castrates, so it'll be difficult, but there is some sort of connection there. So these things are taking place when Dostoevsky is referring to old believers, and I think it's partly because he'd had the advantage when he'd been in prison, in exile in Siberia, of really getting close to the Russian people in a way that many of the middle class or Rasnachensky writers, and even more so the upper class writers like Tolstoy or Turgenev, never were able to do that. So he saw both an inherent goodness in the Russian people, the Russian person, but also sometimes these great potentialities for sort of darkness or extreme behavior as well. So that is, I think, all a part of what's going on here. Because this Mikolka seems to want to take on the guilt of this crime, although it has nothing to do with it at all. The fact that they've have suspicions about him, he decides, well, this is so bad, I don't want to be framed, I don't want to be set up, so as a consequence I'll go and hang myself. So it does seem to be a rather extreme notion. That's the way he's going to get out of being accused of the crime, to do something which everyone will make up there. Well, why did he hang himself? Well, of course he must be guilty. You wouldn't hang yourself if you're not guilty. But this is a type of extreme desire for self-humiliation, if you like, for suffering, which is also meant to bring you closer to the divine that these characters have here. And although it seems that Mikolka is an extreme parody of this notion, in some ways Raskolnikov is also doing the same sort of thing, that he is wanting to suffer in order to be transformed. He perhaps doesn't know that yet. And this notion that only through suffering can you be redeemed, and not just your own suffering, but maybe someone else's, is both a key idea in Dostoevsky, but also possibly problematic. As I said before, there's a Russian saying that if you don't sin, you can't repent. Okay, so that may be okay. It's true, you need to know that you're a sinner in order to be redeemed, to be saved, and so on. But how bad does that crime have to be? Does it really mean that it's the famous phrase of heaven rejoices more in the redemption of one sinner than of hundreds of just people? Well, that's true, but can we assume as a result of this that there is some divine plan that actually has old ladies being murdered just in order that Raskolnikov can learn the error of his ways and somehow be redeemed? It does seem to be a sort of rather strange ends and means calculation. But Dostoevsky is always talking about that in his discussions of theodicy, the justification of the ways of God to man. How can it be that some bad things happen if ultimately there's an all-loving, all-powerful God? So there are different ways of trying to explain this. And some strange logic might even imply, therefore, that everything is as it should be, and that therefore even the death of the old woman is as it should be. Because there are the moments within the text that it seems that everything is being directed towards this outcome, essentially. Whether it's something small, like Raskolnikov seems to be about to confess at one moment, and then all of a sudden Marmeladov gets run over, and then his story takes a slightly different path. So at the moment he's going to go to the police station, this happens, as if he needs to be brought closer to Sonia, as if he needs to go through some more suffering in order to have a better transformation than when if he'd simply gone to the police station and said, yeah, you know what, I did it, and that would be the end of the story. So something strange nonetheless is going on within the text. And this is what's happening, of course, with Mikolka here as well. Okay, 1:30, Raskolnikov does seem worried when the statement about behind the door, some things were found. So this is the true story, that Mikolka found these earrings behind the door. And Raskolnikov is worried because, of course, that, first of all, that's one of the few things that he could know about, that someone was in that place other than the painters, and that person was him. Second, that if he dropped that, maybe he dropped something else as well. Who knows? Maybe he dropped his ID card if he had one, or something that could link him to the scene of the crime. So that's why he is concerned at that particular point. Also, of course, there's his excitement that he knows what happened. He knows that he was there. So it's a split emotion there. Okay, so let's move on then. I think there's too much here. Razumikin does seem to have some pretty good sense of the psychology of the crime, and he's pretty convinced that the painters are not the murderers. And even though there is this awkward detail, well, how did he get the earrings? Is it just convenient that he picked them up and so on? Nonetheless, he says no, that these are not the people who did it, and in that he's, of course, he is right. Okay, and then Luzhin appears, and Luzhin is another of the doubles, if you like, parodic doubles of Raskolnikov within the text, because, of course, although Raskolnikov will criticize Luzhin in these pages for the way that his ideas can lead to pretty terrible things, as soon as he utters those words, Raskolnikov knows that he too has essentially been taking the Luzhin path of what's called rational egoism, that rather than base your behavior on sort of Christian charity, Christian mercy, Christian love, loving thy neighbor, and so on, the idea is that because everyone has pretty much the same desires and ends and values, that if everyone is, every man for himself, will actually lead to everyone's benefit. And so this is the idea of rational egoism. The people essentially want the same thing, so then let's just do what's in our own best interest. If I do what's in my best interest, you do what's in your best interest, those interests will coincide and we'll all benefit, essentially. And the radicals found that this depiction of Luzhin's ideas was a travesty of their own notions of utilitarianism and rational egoism. And there is something to that, but at the same time, many people in the 1860s were perhaps using these ideas as an excuse for selfishness, for enriching themselves and so on. And that's what Luzhin is doing essentially here. And that's why Raskolnikov seems to make this huge leap between saying that your idea that I look after my own financial interests and everyone else will benefit can lead to saying, okay, well, my financial interest is to murder an old woman and take her money, essentially. And Raskolnikov is critical of Luzhin, and at the same time he realizes, hey, perhaps that's not far removed from what I've been doing as well. So this is where the utilitarian and the rational egoism overlap with what Dostoevsky believed was the case with many of these radicals, that ultimately it was far more about a personal desire for power. It was this satanic pride, which pride can be a good thing in some places if it's meaning that you have ambitions and you do all sorts of good things for society. But that was what was present in Bazarov and some of the readings of his behavior, and this is one of those areas where Raskolnikov is in fact quite close to Bazarov. There is that pride and that arrogance which has led him to thinking maybe I am an extraordinary man and maybe I can do these things because I'm entitled to it, essentially. Okay, so Luzhin's a pretty unpleasant character. I think we get that from the depiction. It's pretty clear. He's sort of pompous. He's so out of place in his surroundings, and of course he can't believe that Raskolnikov is Raskolnikov. That's why he addresses his first statements to Zosimov, the doctor, who looks the most presentable of the characters there. Okay, did you have any sort of questions about the exchanges between Luzhin and Raskolnikov? What are some of the things that just reinforce Raskolnikov's belief that Luzhin is a nasty piece of work in this encounter? What are some of the things that we learn? Or perhaps details that get reinforced about Luzhin? What are some of the things that both Razumikin and Raskolnikov are critical of Luzhin for doing? Well, one of the things, of course, is he's put Raskolnikov's mother and sister in this absolutely awful apartment block where Sonia and Marmeladov family and all are sort of hanging out in Libiznyatnikov. So it's this real dive, essentially a brothel and so on. And Luzhin's claim is, well, I didn't know what it would be like, but presumably when he found it, he knew how much it was paying, he knew the location. So actually the details there. Okay, in defense of him, he is trying to find a new apartment for them to live. But at that moment, at least, he's cutting corners, he's not spending much on them, and that just shows that ultimately he doesn't really have great concern for Dunya or Raskolnikov's mother. So as I say, on page 139, 140, there is this sort of key statement. Science says love yourself before loving anyone else, for everything in the world is founded on self-interest. And like I said before, this presupposes that everyone has the same sort of, essentially the same goods, the same advantages, the same thing that benefits them. I said before, the Russian word, so we good at that which is beneficial to you. And if that's the case, then indeed we can organise society pretty clearly, because no one's going to disagree about what the most important values are. The reality, of course, is that people don't agree on so many key things, so how are you going to organise society according to these rational principles? And of course, it's a problem we see to this very day. Okay, so Razumikin first of all claims in 140 that a lot of these apparently radical thinkers are just out to enrich themselves or for their own benefit, and Raskolnikov will take it to the next extreme by saying that if you follow this notion on page 142, taking what you're preaching just now to its conclusions, bumping people off is perfectly acceptable. Well, it seems a stretch, as I say, but at a deeper level it does seem to be significant. I think if you've still got your editions of Fathers and Sons, I would go back and read the article there by Pisarev. In the contemporary reactions to Crime and Punishment, what Pisarev says about Bazarev, I think, is actually very helpful, because he was one of the few people who seems to have understood Bazarev as a positive figure, at least one of the few people among the radical critics who saw Bazarev as a positive figure, and the way he talks about Bazarev, I think, shows the links between Bazarev and Raskolnikov. And certainly we do know that Turgenev felt that Dostoevsky was the only one who really understood Fathers and Sons. Unfortunately, the letter that Dostoevsky wrote to Turgenev about that has been lost. We've only got Turgenev's reply to Dostoevsky. Okay, so I don't think there's too much else here. What was it? Yeah, page 141, we're told that there were 1,500 rubles in ready cash in the chest of drawers, which the thief didn't find, so proving that Raskolnikov hadn't thought everything through very logically. For some reasons, this figure of 1,500 seems to be important to Dostoevsky, probably because it's half of 3,000. So he likes to use the figure 3,000 in the Brothers Karamazov. This is the sum of money that plays a very important role. And later on, I want to talk a bit more about money and symbolism in general in Crime and Punishment. But I think the 3,000 rubles, of course, is just a variation on the 30 rubles, the 30 pieces of silver that Judas got. So it's a nice round number, but except it's got 2 extra zeros on the end. So in Brothers Karamazov, this figure of 3,000 gets split into 2 amounts of money of 1,500 each, which play an important role within the text. So it does seem, it may be a coincidence, but it does seem intriguing that he mentions 1,500 here. Again, if you think about it, it's probably the split of the 3,000 into 2, 13 to 2, so it's 3 is a good symbolic and religious number, and it also hints at the split here between Raskolnikov, the logical side of him, and the side that doesn't think about picking up 1,500 rubles that might be hanging around. Okay. We also get to the bottom of page 141, the reference to all these sort of strange crimes taking place, that sort of students are robbing people, the university professors are doing all sorts of dreadful things as well, completely unbelievable. It's significant that it seems that this is a society in some turmoil, in which all of the moral sort of guidelines are being lost, and I mean anything seems to be permitted. This famous Dostoevsky phrase that everything is permitted, essentially. Okay, so I don't think we need to say too much about the next few pages. Okay, section 6 down 144. After this encounter with Luzhin, which perhaps brings Raskolnikov the understanding that he's not that different from this sort of dreadful person who, of course, has these evil designs on his sister and is involved in all sorts of exploitations of the power differential between them. He decides he wants to go out and end it all. Of course, end it all could take different forms. It could be to confess, or it could be to commit suicide. And obviously, suicide is always a big possibility in the Dostoevsky world. We've already seen Mikolka attempt suicide. And he says on page 145 to himself, all this has to end today in one go right now, because he didn't want to live like this. So this split, at the one moment he'll feel confident, he feels he'll want to go on, he has strength in himself, Other moments he just doesn't want to live with his knowledge of his guilt without confessing it. He doesn't want to feel that he is this, that he's this Cain figure wandering, that no one can relate to him anymore, and he can't relate to people because he's removed himself from any possibility of sort of love or forgiveness. At the same time, the actual giving of money, some kopecks to the girl here, is just a completely free act of charity. It's not has any calculation in it, so that also sort of shows the possibility of a non-utilitarian way of relating kindly to people. He also gives money to the prostitute for no particular reason, which again shows his not very logical nature. At least when he gives money to Sonia, it's not, as Lucian would claim, because he's got some evil sort of cunning plan in mind. It's just because he wants to help Sonia's family. This famous quote on page 148, which seems in part to come from Hugo's Last Day of a Condemned Man, where Dostoevsky says that the desire to live is so strong that you would accept it under any circumstances. If you're being told, okay, you can just stand on this sort of ledge over the ocean for all eternity, the wind's blowing around you, and you know that in reality, and he says that in some other place, I can't remember exactly where, that you know that you wouldn't stand it for more than 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days, ultimately you think, oh, what the hell, I'm going to throw myself off. But at that moment, at least, you're sort of told, no, the life instinct is so strong that you will accept this, what's offered, under any circumstances. And Dostoevsky says that desire, or Raskolnikov implies that this desire to cling to life is somehow indecent or dishonest, but it's also something that he's very much aware of. And this struggle is going on within him, whether he still wants to cling to what Dostoevsky would call live in life, or whether he thinks that if his life is meaningless, he should end it all. And this, of course, will be a theme that will then play out very strongly in another of the big splits in the text between Raskolnikov and Svidrigailov, where again Svidrigailov represents one of Raskolnikov's potential paths, and Sonia represents the other. Okay, so goes to the Crystal Palace again. Obviously, that theme is important here. I don't think there's too much here. So in the scene with Zamyatov, he both wants to tease Zamyatov, and again, it's a struggle. He wants to confess in part, but he doesn't feel that someone like Zamyatov deserves his confession because Raskolnikov is such a great guy and so intelligent and so on. And why should he give in to them so easily? They actually have to work for his confession, essentially, or work to try and trap him there. So it's a space of strange encounter, but it's not the last one. Similar things will happen with Porphyry, but at a deeper level. Zamyatov is also actually quite a good analyst of criminals' potential behavior, and he says, I'd expect you to trip up if you actually came to doing it. And indeed, we know, this is page 153, that Raskolnikov did make certain errors in the committing of the crime. And also the behavior, of course, afterwards is strange. This is a quote from the FBI handbook. It says, post-offense behavior exhibited may be a change in eating habits and drinking habits, more alcohol consumption and nervousness, or an inappropriate interest in the crime. Because I was interested in this actual notion where we say the criminal will return to the scene of the crime. I wasn't sure to what extent that's just a sort of legend, or to what extent it does actually happen. And it seems, in fact, that criminals don't often return to the scene of the crime. However, there might be exceptions. For example, if you're an arsonist, one of the whole points of being an arsonist is the pleasure you get out of viewing the place burned down that you've just set fire to. So if you're an arsonist, you probably will be standing around watching the thing burn, and police and law enforcement know things like this. They can check that. But in general, I don't think murderers don't very often go back to the scene of the crime. If they do and we know about it, then it's certainly worthy of particular note. But in Raskolnikov's case, of course, he will go back to the scene of the crime. And again, that seems to suggest a desire to be caught out. So I don't think there's much. I mean, he does actually say on 154, doesn't he, explicitly, what if it was me who killed the old woman Lizaveta, at precisely a moment where he goes back in his mind to the moment of the crime when the latch is there, when he thinks he's going to be caught, and he wants, and he feels, I suppose his calculation is that at this moment he will completely disarm Zamyatov, and Zamyatov will think, no, there's no way a guy who really is guilty of this would go so far, go right up to the edge of an actual confession. What if I did it, essentially? Okay, he sort of says that. At the end of all of this, Zamyatov's suspicions have been assuaged, and we say Ilya Petrovich is a fool, so presumably that is referring to the fact that Ilya Petrovich does have genuine suspicions that Raskolnikov could be the murderer. But by this moment, Zamyatov is convinced, no, he's not the murderer after all. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so then page 158, Raskolnikov is thinking potentially of killing himself, and the fact that someone throws herself into the water at precisely that moment links the river Neva with the theme of suicide, with the theme of the guilt or the cost of the construction of St. Petersburg, takes us back to the Bronze Horseman. And this person who has been driven to despair by her life circumstances, by her poverty and drunkenness and so on, has tried to kill herself before, had a noose over her, takes us back to the theme of Makrolka, and now she's gone into the water. But she is saved at this moment at least, maybe suggesting that there is also the chance that Raskolnikov can be saved. At the very least, he decides that death by drowning would be too vile. He doesn't want to choose that particular method. So he thinks, what are the other ways to end it? Well, another way to end it would be to go back to the police station and confess. And then he decides, no, what I'll do instead, perhaps make it more interesting. First of all, I'll go back to the scene of the crime. Maybe that will change my feelings about what I feel about the crime. Maybe I'll find out some evidence there that can help me get us a better alibi, or maybe it's just an act of making me look more suspicious, and that will also help to make it easier for them to catch me if I don't have the willpower to confess to this thing, but I'm somehow putting myself in a position where they will catch me. So again, there is a sense that for the strong-willed Raskolnikov, it actually is quite difficult to make these key decisions. Will he or won't he? Will he confess or won't he confess? Okay, so he goes to the apartment. He seems to be quite offended in some ways by some of the transformations that have taken place already in the apartment. They're getting ready to rent it out, somehow thinking that this would be so fixed as it was back then, in all eternity, that somehow this was this key moment that in future museum guys might say this was the place where the great man of the future started off on his road to greatness or something like that. It seems that life is just sort of going on, and that what he's done is just another trivial part of everyday Petersburg life. But certainly his behavior is odd enough, and of course it will lead him into greater danger, because at least one of the people who's witnessed these odd goings-on will later on draw the conclusion that he is the murderer and will actually accuse Raskolnikov of being the murderer, and that will be an important part of the case against him. Okay, so page 163, it seems that Raskolnikov has decided that he has to go and confess, that he's been to the scene of the crime, he's probably thought that what I did was absolutely awful, and it's just aesthetically not pleasing, and everything I've experienced since doing the crime doesn't fit in with my theory, so something is very wrong here, so the best thing for me to do is to overcome the suffering I'm experiencing, try and rejoin the human family, go and confess. So precisely this moment where he thinks that he's at the crossroads, so am I going around, I thought that's going to stop in the middle of the crossroads. So of course the crossroads is always a place where you're going to have this major life decision. Do you go to the right or do you go to the left? Well, not with the crossroads, but you go, that's one of four ways. But remember back in the Queen of Spades, the notion of do you take a turn to the right, do you take a turn to the left, is symbolic. Going to the left is normally the way of the devil. And we see those things occur in Crime and Punishment as well. So he doesn't know what to do, as if he were expecting someone to utter the last word one way or another. So instead of being a new word which he expressed, someone has to pass judgment, a final last word on Raskolnikov's project at this particular point. But there was no response from anywhere. Everything was desolate and dead, like the stones on which he trod. So this is almost like going back to the beginning of the creation of St. Petersburg, where the whole city is, well, there's nothing there. It's dead, it's desolate. It's the shore lashed by desolate waves, by empty waves, that vacuum which was there before Peter the Great decided to change everything. The fact that the stones there as well also reinforces that this is all about Petersburg and Petersburg idea. So was it dead for him alone? So the sense is that he doesn't want to go on living like this. He wants to still be part of humanity, because he felt when he did this crime, he was going to be valued as one of the saviors and helpers of humanity, and the result has been the exact opposite of that. And it's precisely at this moment where he doesn't know what to do that fate seems to intervene. So again, that's why I say that it suggests that there is some other narrative taking place here, which is unusual for the realist novel in the Western tradition, that you can read the whole thing as somehow narrated or plotted by a higher power, essentially. Of course, it could simply be some fate. It could simply be the fact that Dostoevsky doesn't want to end his novel here. Russian writers, as I said before, got paid by the page, and he was poor. So rather than writing a novella, he wants to drag it out as long as possible to get more money. So he does need to have all these plot twists, and it's a serial publication. People want to read it next month, and so on and so forth. So it might not just be the hand of God. It might also be the fact that he wants to earn more money and still has a lot to say in his text. Whatever reason, Raskolnikov's fate will take a different path now because he'll be brought back into the orbit of the Marmeladov family, and in particular, of course, of Sonia, who ultimately will be his well, again, will play a very important role in the text. But okay, so Marmeladov, I think not unexpectedly, has got drunk and fallen under the horses. The horses, once again, could be seen as part of this apocalyptic symbol of St. Petersburg, the bronze horseman, the horseman of the apocalypse, etc., etc. Also progress, so Marmeladov is another of these victims of progress, essentially. There. A terrible sin, Lord, what a sin, so sin, crime, all of these things connected. Incidentally, I think I made a slight mistake before when Raskolnikov said, is my punishments have started? I wanted to point out that the Russian word that is used back then, when he says my punishment started, is actually the word of kazin, which means like execution or official punishment. It can also mean like the divine punishment at the end of time. So it's not exactly the same word that he uses as the pristuplenia, punishment, naказание. It's not the same word as the punishment in the title there. So although the translator chose the word punishment because that probably is the best way to do it, it's not the same word as the word in the title. It's also the beheading, so Nabokov's invitation to beheading, which we will look at in the 20th century, is priglashение nakazin, this invitation to this execution, beheading, punishment, essentially. Okay, so Marmeladov looks in a bad way, even though there's still something noble about him. That's another place where he's linked with Raskolnikov, and Raskolnikov sort of shows this very different side to his nature here, and increasingly the younger, more Christian Raskolnikov comes through here in the charity he shows to the Marmeladov family, and the fact that he'll say to the young girls of Paulinka, "Oh, will you pray for me? Pray for your servant Rodion," and so on. So this is another side of Raskolnikov, which is certainly a part of the picture as well. Okay, so he's trying to sort of do good here, but of course the dilemma for him is how can he do good when he's a murderer, essentially. So we get the depiction of Sonia on page 171. How out of place she looks in all sorts of ways, and that might be another place where she is also marginal in society, is also linked with Raskolnikov, that they're both sort of victims. Just as he is this very beautiful, very handsome individual, but badly dressed, she too is, sort of young, innocent, scared, but wearing all of these fancy, sort of garish, sort of vulgar clothes, essentially, for her sort of profession. So there's something very paradoxical about her, which also links up with Raskolnikov, I think. We get, I think, a very sort of definite contrast between Raskolnikov's sort of pure-hearted sort of kindness here, and given the last money he's got, that seems to be, again, a very sort of biblical notion, like the widow's mite, you give everything you had. Okay, it's not his money to give, essentially. He will confess that later. It's his mother's money that they've been suffering to give him. But he does want to help because he knows that otherwise Katerina Ivanovna's days are going to be even worse if he doesn't help her in this way. And it's meant to contrast with the platitudes of the priest here, who will sort of talk about that forgives the call for the hour of death, but this is a sin, ma'am. Such feelings as these are so truly a sin. She says, Father, these are nothing but words, forgive. What's forgiveness got to do with it? Haven't I forgiven him enough? So there is this sort of contrast here, which you quite often get in Russian literature, even from the most religious of the writers, like Dostoevsky, that the official church is often seen as somehow corrupt, incompetent, or just not really up to the job. Chekhov is very good at showing that as well. There's a great scene in one story where a priest is also dealing with the death of a baby, and he says to the mother, fear not, for such as these have a place in the kingdom of heaven, he says. But Chekhov tells her right at that moment he's like positioning a race of fat, pickled mushroom on a fork and trying to put it into his mouth in the moment of talking. He's actually saying those things. So he doesn't mean it, he's just reading from a script, essentially. And it seems here that the priest is doing the same thing. So official religion is not actually shown in a good light here. Raskolnikov, the murderer, is actually doing things which are helpful in a sort of in terms of Christian charity. Okay, so there is that sort of contrast there. Okay, so we get a final deathbed reconciliation, if you like, between Sonia and her father, Marmeladov, almost like a pietà embrace, that he is there like the suffering figure, and she is embracing him. So the roles are reversed, the daughter and the father there. Okay, so he gives the money, and then we're told that he's sort of soaked in blood. Sir Nikodym Fomitch says that, and he's read with two types of blood. So there's the negative blood of the murder that he can't wash away, and then the blood of Marmeladov when he's trying to actually help, and he's sacrificing himself rather than sacrificing another person. Okay, but after all of this, he does feel this new, top of page 174, a new boundless sensation of life surged over him suddenly in all its strength. The fact he's actually been able to sort of do good does seem to inspire him. It does make him feel more alive. But at the same time, there was this sort of huge discrepancy from this huge problem. Okay, yes, I feel that, but I'm also a murderer. How can these two things coexist? How can he, make himself into that person who's doing good for people and overcome the fact that he's already shed blood in his murder? And of course, the whole book will be about that. Is that an impossibility, or is there some miracle that can happen in order for Raskolnikov to be the person who can do the good things and not somehow be completely compromised by the fact that he has committed this crime? And that's where the theme of Lazarus, of the resurrection of the dead, of someone who is dead coming back to life, will be so important. Okay, so some of the stuff might be a bit sentimental in this Dickensian way, but I think overall it's a pretty powerful depiction of the immense suffering of the Marmeladov family, and also shows Raskolnikov in a particularly good light. Okay, on page 175, he suddenly says that enough, no more mirages, no more false fears. I didn't die with the old hag, and say, I can move on. Maybe those ideas I had that this is just this is just an incident. This is just a footnote. It's not important. I did these things, but life can go on. I can feel good about life. I can do all sorts of things. I can love. I can live. These things have happened. I can do good for these people. And he starts to feel the more powerful, the more willful Raskolnikov returning. Okay, but he says that, okay, I feel feeble now, but strength is what needed, and you can only get strength by being strong, essentially. But then the narrator says, what on earth could happen to bring about such a change? He himself did not know, and maybe the implications of something at a different level is starting to happen here, that this is the start of the narrative involving Sonia, this is the start of the narrative involving Christian redemption, but Raskolnikov doesn't know that. He's thinking it more in terms of the power of the extraordinary man. Okay, he says, still I did mention request your servant Rodion, suddenly flashed to his mind, so this is the split, the looking for forgiveness, looking for redemption, or being the Superman there. But that's just in case. Remember, he'd used that phrase just in case before. In the opposite way, I'll go to the old woman to check these things out, just in case I kill her. But I'm probably not going to do it. He ended up killing her. So now maybe it's just in case I do need to be forgiven. I do need some divine intervention. I do need someone to pray for me. So that's what's being talked about here. Okay, so I don't think there's too much here we need to mention. Okay, so he's going back home, and his mother and sister are waiting for him. So that's the end of this particular section. Okay, let's move on to part 3 then. Any questions about the first 2 parts of the book? Any observations, problems, things that don't make sense? All pretty clear thus far? You can see the different vectors, arguments taking place. Okay, good. Okay, so one of the important things about Dunya, of course, is the parallels that she may have with Raskolnikov, the way they're described physically. They're quite similar. Their temperaments are quite similar as well. What are some of the things that they seem to have in common, Dunya and Raskolnikov? Apart from the things I just mentioned there, anything else they have in common? I mean, they both seem to be very proud people, don't they? And they both have these flashing eyes to those moments of passion within them that seem to be important. And the possibility of actually acting in some type of extreme way, which of course in the case of Dunya has been her willingness, although quite sort of calculating, to sacrifice herself for Lucian. And she will say to Raskolnikov later, look, don't give yourself such airs. It's not just about you. I don't have many options in my life as well, particularly after all of this stuff with Svidrigailov. Lucian is the lesser of two evils. I'm under no apprehension and there are no illusions about what I'm agreeing to. But in some ways, when I made the decision about Lucian, it wasn't just about you, brother. It was about my best interests as well. But the other side of her knows that this is probably not. It's not a good move, and increasingly, Lucian's behaviour will just convince her of the fact that she has to dump him because of the sort of person he is. Raskolnikov is probably quite cruel to her as well in saying that this is a scoundrel's marriage, and if you marry him, you're a scoundrel, particularly when he knows that to some extent she's doing it for his benefit. And that's precisely why he's so upset, of course, and that's precisely why he might even be blaming her in part for what he did, because it was in order to avoid such humiliation and sacrifice on Dunya's part that he actually committed the crime. It's a small part of it, but nonetheless, it is there as well. Okay, so let's move on. Razumihin, I think, is a very attractive character in many ways. I mean, whether he would come out with such confessions of love, having met Dunya for the first time, like that, it's perhaps a bit implausible, but his excuse is that he's pretty drunk at that moment. Okay, so let's move on. On page 190, you get that depiction of Dunya, Avdotya Romanova is described there. Okay, let's see what else we can do. Okay, no, there's too much here. Okay, page 200, I think it's quite an important depiction by Razumihin of Raskolnikov. Says, what can I say? I've known Rodion for a year and a half. He's sullen, gloomy, haughty, proud, and recently, perhaps much earlier too, he's paranoid and hypochondriac. So that's quite a depiction of him. So when you have to come to write your descriptions of Raskolnikov and say, what is his state of mind there, I think Razumihin's giving you a pretty good depiction. Sometimes, though, he's not hypochondriac at all, just cold and unfeeling to an almost inhuman degree, as if two contrasting characters were taking turns inside him. Now, arguably, Dostoevsky's been a bit too explicit here. He's given him this name, Raskolnikov. This name means they split in two, and he's telling us this. So perhaps it doesn't need to be as clear-cut as that. But it's a good quote you can use, I suppose, so that helps. Okay, so I don't think there's anything much there. What about the backstory about why Raskolnikov wanted to marry his landlady's daughter, who seems to have died almost conveniently for the plot a year before? What are we told about Raskolnikov's desire to marry her, and how is the landlady's daughter described physically? Can you pay attention to that? We're told she's rather unusual in her appearance, at least, and Raskolnikov would even say at one point it would have been better if she'd been a hunchback or something, so make out if she'd looked like Quasimodo, he would have preferred to marry her. So what do you think is going on here? Why does he want to marry someone who wouldn't necessarily perhaps be of the first choice of bride? Why is he saying, oh yeah, I was going to marry her, and if she'd been even more unusual, that would have been even better? Why do you think he says that? And if you read other Dostoevsky works, you'll see that same theme. In The Devils, for example, Stavrogin, who is rich and handsome and a prince, chooses someone very unexpected to be married to for all sorts of reasons within the time. Well, presumably it's part of this notion almost of being, of self-martyrdom, essentially, that, why would you pick someone who seems to be inappropriate for you, or that your life's not going to be very happy with them? Well, because you want to suffer, essentially, and you want also people to think, wow, wasn't that noble of Raskolnikov to marry her? So that sense of, it's a self-exalting thing to make yourself look better, but it's also a desire to take suffering upon yourself as well. So this theme of martyrdom, again, comes into his backstory with the landlady's daughter. Okay, so so continue reading it. So we'll have the next quiz on Wednesday, and